Yo, we hooked up last night. You performed those lines many, many times and have shared that line many, many times before, right? Picture it, right? Thorn, Saturday morning brunch, right? Working off that non-existent hangover that you don't tell your parents about, right? From the party you enjoyed the night before, right? And someone says those 5 magic words, "We hooked up last night." And all of a sudden, the hangover deactivates, the caffeine kicks in, right? And you're filled with all sorts of questions, right? Sometimes the person may share, actually, the aspect of that experience. And other times, they keep their mouths shut, right? But one of the things we recognize is the fact that "we hooked up last night" is not the only time it is heard in that particular place, right? Throughout the dining hall, in restaurants, bedrooms, living rooms across the country and around the world, people are saying the exact same 5 words. And never have 5 words, a simple sentence, "we hooked up last night," is filled with so many meanings, right? Whether it means you're engaging in full-on intercourse, or the fact that you simply held hands while watching Coco with your partner, right? The notions of these simple words, "we hooked up last night," right, is all about the ways in which we love ambiguity in sex. We revel in the notions of ambiguity. We like the fact that when we talk about sex and sexuality, we keep the meanings wide open, right? It gives us a sense of power and control over the narratives we think we're giving. For others, we say it's nobody's damn business. Nevertheless, right, these words with a panoply of meanings produces a series of problems when we understand what it means to be sexual beings in the world, right? Despite the fact that we think ambiguity is great, right, the ways in which that those ambiguities haunt us throughout our everyday lives. We take for granted the ways in which we're controlled often by these discourses. So my talk today will think about ambiguity in sexuality and sex talk, right? Now, I'm not going to say to you, right, I refuse to have your parents call and tell me that I'm going to tell you to have more sex. That's not the goal here. Instead, I do believe, as a doctor of sexuality, that we should be talking about sex a whole lot more. Why do we revel in the ambiguity that exists within sex and sexuality, right? Sometimes it really is the fact that we believe that our sexual lives are a private thing, that it's our business and nobody else's. But there's no social phenomenon, right, that exists in the world that is more social than sex, particularly when we have it, right? Psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud argues that sex is social, primarily because society teaches us how not to do it, how not to engage in it, to suppress the desires that are so natural within us, right? Despite that fact, we find many different ways to engage in sex and sexuality, right? Michel Foucault once noted that even though we believed that the discourses around sex were suppressed, people talked about it more than ever. The secret, however, is that those discourses were limited to certain kinds of social spheres. We confessed about having sex in church. We talk about sex and our sexual desires in the psychiatrist's office. And somehow we relate that as a form of secret shame. We're too afraid to actually tell people what our desires are and what really makes us feel good. We often think about sex and sexuality and the ambiguity, right, as a way to sort of claim a sense of power, right? We think about it in terms of how we can control the narrative, especially when what's available to us in terms of those conversations often are very limiting within themselves. Sexuality, in particular, has become increasingly more problematic as more and more people are expressing their sexual selves before we even have a language to discuss it. When the actor Nick Tortella recently got married, the notion of him being described as a demisexual began to send shockwaves throughout social media. What on earth does he mean by demisexual? He's really trying to articulate the ways in which He doesn't feel that the traditional terms that people use to describe his own desire makes any sense. So he creates something to say that he only gets desire when he feels an emotional attachment to someone. It opens a space that allows for him to be able to live his full sexual self. We often sometimes enjoy the ambiguity to hide our own ignorance about sex and sexuality. How many of us say we hooked up last night and really think about how clumsy the sexual experience was the night before? The majority of young millennials, actually, when they talk about their previous first experiences, often think of them in a negative light. Think about the things that they wish they had known or wish they understood before they actually engaged in that first sexual encounter, that erotic moment. The fact that we don't talk about sex and sexuality in real, concrete language often becomes a stymie to us as we begin to sort of explore who we are as sexual people. So even as we push back against the ways in which society teaches us about sex, right, we're constantly learning, we're constantly getting messages and transmitting ideas to each other about what sex and sexual experiences ought to be. How many of you learned really about sex from kids on the playground as opposed to your parents? Or the fact that we often teach sex education in schools to tell you simply not to do it. I've had many occasions where students tell me that sex talks with their parents included nothing more than a father or a mother throwing a pair of condoms at them, right? And say, just make sure you use them. But those have really serious consequences as well in terms of what we mean when we don't actually talk and articulate about how we feel, not only to each other, right, but to our own sexual partners. Increasingly today, we're now living in a world mobilizing around issues of sex and sexual violence. And the ratio that exists between men who believe they're obtaining consent from a woman, right, versus men who believe they're getting consent from a woman through nonverbal cues, versus women who believe, right, that they're giving consent through nonverbal cues is 6-to-1. We create a number of misunderstandings that often take place in the erotic moment. And we're now trying to find new language to fight the injustice that surrounds us in terms of these discussions of sex and sexuality. We blame Aziz Ansari, right, for abusing his power. We never really think about seriously the ways in which his understandings about the erotic moment are shaped by the failure for us to actually talk about sex in a real meaningful way. And so as we continue to move forward and think about the theme of today's talk, right, as Time's Up and Me Too become these mobilizing calls to action, I invite you to also say that it's time's up for us to have inadequate education around sex. It is time up for us to feel a personal shame around who we are in terms of living our true sexual lives. The time is up for us to keep silent about what we find desirable and passionate within us. Time's up for not communicating to our partner what those feelings actually are. Let there be a day where we can articulate that when we have and experience healthy sexual relationships, we also can say, me too. Thank you.